Why do some stories survive for thousands of years while others fade away? What made ancient people tell tales of thunder gods, wise ravens, and heroes who traveled to the underworld? And here's an even bigger question. Why do these same stories still speak to us today? Welcome to the Pagan Temple. I'm Matt, and in this episode, we're going to explore the foundation of every pagan tradition, the mythology. This is a foundational resource, which means I'm assuming you're completely new to this topic, no prior knowledge required, and if you've been curious about mythology but felt overwhelmed by where to start or how to interpret it, this video is for you. And by the end, you'll understand what mythology actually means, why the common definition misses the point entirely, where our mythological sources come from and how to approach them, the different types of myths and what they're trying to do, how mythology varies across pagan traditions, and how to actually work with the mythology in your own spiritual journey. The full written guide to this with sources and book recommendations will be available on our website. I'll put the link in the description. Let's dive in. So let's start with the major problem. When most people hear the word myth, they think it means false story, fake story, untrue story. You've probably heard someone say, well, that's just a myth, when they want to dismiss an idea. Here's the thing. This common usage completely misses what mythology actually is. Mythology refers to a collection of traditional stories that carry deep meaning for a culture or spiritual tradition. These stories feature gods, goddesses, heroes, and supernatural beings. They explore the big questions. Why are we here? What happens when we die? What does it mean to live a good life? Let me give you an analogy that might help. Think of mythology as a culture's operating system. Just like your phone's operating system shapes how everything works on that device, mythology shaped how ancient people understood their entire world. It influenced their values, their rituals, their art, and every daily decision. Now let's make an important distinction. A myth is a single story. Mythology is the whole collection of myths belonging to a specific tradition. Mythology also refers to the study of those myths. So when we say Norse mythology, we mean all the stories, characters, and themes that make up the Norse mythic tradition. Here's something really important to understand, and I want you to let this sink in. Asking the question of whether myths are true or false, whether they're real or just story, misses the point entirely. Myths don't have to operate on the same level as a newspaper, a news report, a science textbook, etc. They speak in symbol, in metaphor, and narrative. Their truth is emotional, spiritual, supernatural, and psychological, rather than literal. That doesn't mean they're less valuable, they're less true, and in many ways it means they're more valuable. They touch something deeper than just facts. So why does this matter for you as someone exploring paganism? Let me give you 3 big reasons. First, myths introduce us to the deities and other metaphysical beings. Through the stories, we learn about the personalities, the values, and the domains of various gods, goddesses, and entities. Odin's sacrifice for wisdom tells us about his character. Brigid's association with poetry and smithcraft shapes how practitioners approach her. The myths are like biographies of the divine world. Secondly, mythology provides templates for practice. Many rituals, offerings, and devotional practices draw directly from mythological sources. The stories teach us what the gods value and how to honor them appropriately. And thirdly, myths offer wisdom for living. They explore themes like sacrifice, loyalty, transformation, and facing death. These themes remain relevant because human nature hasn't fundamentally changed. The challenges we face in relationships, in work, and our own personal growth echo the same challenges faced by other mythological heroes. So the key takeaway is mythology isn't about true or false. It's a language of symbolism, of story that carries spiritual wisdom and connects us to these ancient traditions. Now that we have a basic understanding of what mythology is, let's talk about where it comes from. And this is where things get interesting because it's not as straightforward as you might think. Most ancient pagan cultures passed their stories through oral tradition. Skilled storytellers, poets, bards, priests memorized vast amounts of mythological material and passed it from generation to generation orally. These oral traditions were living things. They could shift and change over time, and that's okay. Different regions might tell the same story a little bit differently, and again, that is okay. There wasn't necessarily one official version of the story. Eventually, some of these stories were written down, but here's where it gets complicated. Many myths were first written down by people who were no longer practicing that original belief system. Christian monks preserved much of Norse and Celtic mythology. Greek myths were compiled by scholars long after the living worship of the gods had faded out of memory. Now, this doesn't mean the written sources are worthless, not at all. It just means we need to read them thoughtfully, understanding that they may include later additions or different interpretations layered over the original material. Let me walk you through the main sources for some of these major traditions. For Norse mythology, our primary sources are the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. The Poetic Edda is a collection of Old Norse poems. The Prose Edda was compiled by the Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century. Both were written down after Iceland had already converted to Christianity. Celtic mythology comes through medieval Irish and Welsh manuscripts. The Ulster cycle and the Mabinogion contain many important myths. Again, these were written by Christian scribes, archaeological evidence, and comparative studies kind of help fill in the gaps. Greek and Roman mythology is preserved in numerous ancient texts. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, Ovid's Metamorphoses. These traditions actually have the most extensive written records among all the different pagan mythologies. Egyptian mythology survives through pyramid texts, papyrus documents, and temple inscriptions. The Egyptians themselves wrote extensively about their gods and religious practices, which gives us a lot more direct access to their worldview. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think honesty is important in education. There's a lot we don't know. Many aspects of ancient pagan practice weren't written down or have even been lost to time. Some traditions, like those of the Slavic peoples or the pre-Christian Baltic cultures, have very limited surviving mythology. This is where modern practitioners face interesting choices. Some focus only on what can be historically documented. Others engage in reconstruction, using comparative methods and educated guessing to fill in the gaps. What this means is, like, say, for Norse mythology, we look at some cultural stuff or the Germanic peoples and other like surrounding areas to fill in the gaps of what these things mean. We can actually use Hinduism as a guide for how polytheism, because that's still a living tradition, how polytheism worked amongst other ancient peoples. So a lot of people will embrace the modern innovation while honoring those historic roots. All of these approaches have value. What matters is being honest about what we know versus what we're reconstructing or creating. Key takeaway for this would be our mythological sources have complex histories. Understanding how myths were preserved helps us read them more thoughtfully. Not all myths do the same thing. Scholars have identified several categories of myths based on their function. Understanding these categories helps you recognize what a particular story is trying to accomplish. I'm going to walk you through 5 major types, and don't worry, I'll define all these terms as we go. First, we have creation myths, also called cosmogony. That word literally means birth of the cosmos. Creation myths answer the big question: why is there something rather than nothing? How did the world come into being? Where did everything come from? In Norse mythology, the world emerges from meeting of fire and ice in a primordial void called Ginnungagap. In Egyptian mythology, the world rises from the waters of chaos. Greek mythology defines or describes the emergence of order from chaos through a succession of divine beings. Creation myths establish the basic structure of reality. They explain why the world has the features it does, and even why humans exist within it. Next, we have what we call origin myths, or etiology or etiological myths. These explain how specific things came to be. Why do we have seasons? Why do spiders spin webs? Why do we perform certain rituals? The Greek myth of Demeter and Persephone is a perfect example. Demeter's grief during her daughter's time in the underworld causes winter. Her joy at Persephone's return brings spring. This myth gave the ancient Greeks a story that made sense of their agricultural calendar. Hero myths follow exceptional individuals through trials and adventures. The scholar Joseph Campbell identified a common pattern he called the hero's journey. It's a common writing practice for writing novels. A hero leaves their ordinary life, faces some challenges, gains wisdom or power, and then returns completely transformed. These myths provide models for human development. They teach us about courage, about sacrifice and transformation. The challenges faced by heroes like Heracles, Cuchulainn, or Sigurd mirror the challenges we face in our own lives through an amplified symbolic form. Theogony, or divine myths, means birth of the gods. These myths focus on the deities themselves, their origins, their relationships, their conflicts, and their natures. Divine myths help us understand who the deities are and what they represent. Stories of divine wars, like the Olympians defeating the Titans, or the Aesir's conflict with the giants, the Jotun, or the fight between the Aesir and the Vanir. It establishes which powers rule the universe and why. Finally, eschatology, or deals with endings, the fate of the world, the fate of the souls after death. Things like Ragnarok in Norse mythology describes the twilight of the gods, when the current world will end in fire and flood, but even Ragnarok includes the promise of renewal, with a new world rising from the destruction. Egyptian mythology includes detailed descriptions of the afterlife journey and the judgment of souls. Different types of myths serve different purposes, as you see. Recognizing what kind of myth you're reading helps you understand what it's trying to teach you. Different pagan traditions have their own distinct mythologies. While there are some common themes and sometimes surprising connections between traditions, each has its own character and emphasis. Let me give you a brief tour of some major traditions to help you orient. Norse mythology centers on 2 groups of deities, the Aesir and the Vanir. After warring with each other, these groups eventually made peace. The Aesir include Odin the Allfather, Thor the Thunder God, and Frigg, the goddess of marriage and fate. The Vanir include Frey and Freya, associated with fertilities and magic, and Njord, the god of the sea. These gods live in Asgard, connected to our world by the Rainbow Bridge or the Bifrost. Norse myths have a distinctive flavor. They're often gritty, humorous, and surprisingly human. Even the gods have flaws, make mistakes, and face consequences. The looming shadow of Ragnarok gives Norse mythology a sense of fate and doom, but also of courage in the face of inevitable endings. Celtic mythology encompasses the traditions of Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and other Celtic regions. Irish mythology features the Tuatha De Danann, a race of divine beings who eventually retreated into the Hollow Hills to become the Fae folk, the fairy folk. Welsh mythology, preserved in the Mabinogion, tell of figures like Rhiannon, Pywel, and the wizard-like Gwydion, as I mentioned in a previous episode. Celtic myths are often dreamlike and full of transformation. Characters change shape, travel between worlds, and encounter magic at every turn. The boundary between the mortal world and the other world is thin and easily crossed. Greek mythology features the Olympian gods, Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, and the rest of the familiar pantheon that you get from the Greek mythology. Roman mythology adapted much from the Greeks, though it had its own indigenous elements. Jupiter corresponds directly to Zeus, Mars and Ares, Venus and Aphrodite. These mythologies are highly developed and psychologically sophisticated. The gods have complex personalities and relationships. Greek tragedy explored the mythological heritage with philosophical depth, examining fate, justice, and human nature. Egyptian mythology developed over thousands of years along the Nile River. Major deities include Ra, the sun god, Osiris, lord of the underworld, Isis, the great magician, Horus, the sky god, Set, the god of chaos, and Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing. Egyptian myths focus heavily on concepts like Ma'at, which means cosmic order and justice, the afterlife, and the daily journey of the sun. The story of Osiris, murdered by Set and resurrected through the magic of Isis, provides a template for Egyptian afterlife journey. Now, I'm going to address another one, something important that often confuses beginners. Wicca, as a modern religious movement, doesn't have a strong mythology in the same sense of the ancient traditions. Wicca draws on existing mythologies from various cultures and has developed its own ritual frameworks and theological ideas. Some Wiccans work primarily with Celtic deities, others with Greek, and still others, with a more eclectic approach. And I will say that's all valid, and there's no issues with that, as long as it's done respectfully. Here's the key point. Many people mistakenly treat all pagan traditions as interchangeable, and not every pagan tradition is eclectic, because they're not. Each tradition has its own distinct mythology, its own practices, and cultural context. That's important. The Wheel of the Year, for example, is specifically a Wiccan practice. It doesn't belong to all pagan paths. Norse practitioners have their own calendar of days. Celtic traditions have different observances. Being aware of these distinctions shows respect and helps you avoid confusion in your own personal studies. All right, now that we've covered the what, the where, and the why, let's talk about how. How do you actually work with mythology in your own spiritual journey? I'm going to give you 5 practical steps for beginners. Step 1. Choose a single tradition to start with. Rather than trying to learn everything at once, pick one mythological tradition that calls to you. Maybe your ancestry connects you to Norse or Celtic traditions. Maybe Egyptian mythology has fascinated you, or it's your own personal ancestral connection. Starting with one tradition allows you to develop real depth before trying to branch out or trying to learn too much. Step 2, read the primary sources from good translations. Don't rely only on summaries or retellings. Don't rely only on the Pagan temple. Read the actual source texts in the good translations. For Norse mythology, try the Poetic Edda, translated by Geraldine Larrington. It's a very accurate translation, or the one by Jackson Crawford. It's very easily digested. It's very easy to understand. For Greek, read Homer and the Hesiod. Getting the stories firsthand gives you a much richer understanding than secondhand summaries. I'll link some recommended translations in the description or in the text-based version of this in the link in the description. Step 3, read the myths many times. Myths reveal new layers with repeated reading. The first time through, you're just getting the plot. Later readings reveal more symbolism, more connections, and those deeper meanings. Don't rush it. Let the story sink in over time. Step 4, reflect on this and write in a journal. A journal is one of the most important things you can have as a young pagan. I'll pull mine out here. It's just a notebook. It's a way to write information. Step 4, reflect and journal. I have my own journal here that I write in notes from things that I read, understandings that I may have, questions I might have, and I'll be looking for the answers in those mythologies. After reading the myth, spend time reflecting on it. What struck you? What questions do you have? What themes seem relevant to your own life? Keeping that mythology journal helps you process what you're learning and track your developing understanding of those mythologies. Step 5, dive in and learn the cultural context. Myths make more sense when you understand the culture that created them. Learn about the daily life, the values and concerns of the ancient people whose myths you're studying. This context enriches your understanding of why certain themes and symbols appear. Now let me address some common challenges that you might face in this. Some common things where I feel overwhelmed by how much there is to learn. Yeah, I get it. I hear this all the time. Here's one thing. Ancient pagans didn't learn the mythology all at once either. They grew up absorbing these stories over a lifetime. Be patient with yourself. Focus on one story at a time. Depth is more valuable than breadth when you're starting out. Maybe you ask yourself, say, I'm not sure which version of a myth is correct. Ancient mythology wasn't standardized the way modern religions often are these days. Different regions and different time periods had variations. This is normal and expected. Focus on understanding the major sources rather than trying to find the one true version. If it helps, try to find the earliest version of that and learn from there. You may ask yourself, some myths seem problematic by modern standards. Yeah, some of them are. Ancient cultures had different values than we do today. You can appreciate the wisdom and spiritual value in myths while also recognizing that some elements reflect their historical context. Many modern practitioners adapt their relationship with problematic material thoughtfully. Before we wrap this up, let me share some common pitfalls for you to avoid. These are mistakes I see beginners making often, and I want to help you sidestep them. First, especially when you first start out, don't treat the myths as literal history. Myths often operate on a symbolic level. Looking for archaeological evidence that Thor actually fought giants misses the point of what mythology does. Second, don't mix traditions carelessly. While eclecticism can be valid, randomly combining elements from different mythologies without understanding their context can just lead to more confusion and even cultural insensitivity. Third, don't rely only on pop culture. Marvel movies and video games spark interest, TV shows spark interest, and they're fun, but they're not accurate sources for understanding the mythology. Always go back to the primary sources. Fourth, don't assume your ancestry determines which mythology you explore. While ancestral connection can be meaningful, most pagan traditions are open to sincere seekers regardless of ethnic background. What matters is approaching traditions with respect. And fifth, don't ignore the difference between open and closed practices. Some traditions welcome all seekers, others have closed or even semi-closed practices that require initiation or a belonging to a specific cultural community. Learn which is which and respect those boundaries. Okay, let's recap what we've covered today. Mythology isn't about true or false. It's a language of symbolism and story that carries spiritual wisdom. Our mythological sources have complex histories that shape how we read them. Different types of myths serve different purposes, from creation stories to hero journeys to tales of the gods. Each pagan tradition has its own distinct mythology with its own character, and you can start working with mythology by choosing one tradition, reading the primary sources, and reflecting deeply on what you find. So, what now? Here are your next steps. If you want to keep building your foundation, check out other videos on what is paganism, finding your path, browse the Pagan Temple website. There'll be links in the descriptions and on the website. If a specific tradition is calling to you, we have introduction texts on Norse, Celtic, and other paths. If you want to dive into specific myths, our pagan parable series that I've started is going to start telling a lot of these individual stories with some cultural context and modern applications. Again, a full written guide for today's content with sources and book recommendations will be on our website, link in the description. If you have any questions or want to discuss the mythology with other learners, other new pagans, please join our Discord community. It's The Grove. It's a welcoming space for practitioners of all levels. Link will be in the description, links on the website. All of our educational content is free and always will be. If you want to support this work, when you go to sign up for our Discord server, you can choose to become a temple guardian, and it will, just add a little bit of money to the Pagan Temple to help us continue this, or just honestly just sharing these videos to somebody who might benefit is all we ask for. Thanks for learning with the Pagan Temple today. Again, my name is Matt. If you have any questions, reach out on our Discord server. And I hope this gives you a solid foundation for exploring the rich world of pagan mythology. And until next time, continue being the best part of what we're doing at the Pagan Temple, and I'll see you in the next one.